Riley Shaw could have easily been mistaken for someone you'd pass by on a quiet street, unnoticed among the everyday faces that fill the corners of any suburban neighborhood. She had that kind of unassuming presence, the kind that doesn't draw attention, but neither does it go unnoticed. Her jeans were well worn but not threadbare, her jacket comfortable but not extravagant. Her house, tucked into a modest cul-de-sac, stood as a reflection of the life she had built for herself in the years since she left the military. To any onlooker, she appeared to be just another woman living a quiet life, far removed from the chaos of a past most people would never understand. But Riley Shaw wasn't just another woman. She wasn't simply the woman who picked up groceries at the local store, or the one who smiled politely at her neighbors when they waved from across the street. No. Riley's past was a story few knew, and fewer still could even imagine. She was a former sniper with the Ghost Division, a unit so secretive that its very existence was often shrouded in mystery. A unit of soldiers who handled the missions no one else could. The ones that didn't make headlines. The ones that, if they did their jobs right, no one would ever know about. In the years following her departure from active duty, Riley sought nothing but peace. She left the life of high-stakes missions behind her, along with the haunting memories of a world she could never fully escape. And yet, no matter how hard she tried to blend into the normalcy of suburban life, the memories of those days never quite faded. They were always there, lurking just beneath the surface. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, gave a glimpse into the woman she used to be. Her movements, measured and deliberate, revealed a discipline that came from a lifetime of training. But she never talked about it. She never bragged about the impossibly accurate shots that had saved countless lives. She never sought recognition. And she never wanted anyone to know that her quiet demeanor hid the heart of a true legend. On the outside, Riley appeared just like anyone else. There was nothing particularly striking about her appearance. She wasn't a movie star or an athlete, and she certainly wasn't trying to be anything she wasn't. Yet, there was something undeniably commanding about her presence, a quiet confidence that radiated from her. It was as if the weight of her experience rested lightly on her shoulders. But her eyes, those eyes held a depth that hinted at the stories she had never shared. To those who looked closely, it was obvious she had seen things, done things, and survived things that most could never even fathom. Despite her background, Riley had built a life for herself in the way she wanted it. She spent her days reading books on the porch, taking long walks in the park, and working a low-profile job at a local small business. She attended neighborhood barbecues, greeted her neighbors with a warm smile, and participated in community events. From all appearances, Riley was just another person trying to carve out a life after a career that had demanded everything from her. But what most didn't know was that Riley Shaw was not just any ordinary woman. She was a woman whose extraordinary abilities were as quiet and unassuming as the life she had built for herself. Her past, however, was not something she wore on her sleeve. It was hidden, buried beneath layers of normalcy, far from the prying eyes of a world that would never truly understand. She had been a part of something bigger than most could comprehend, and now she wanted nothing more than to be left alone. She didn't need the accolades or the attention. For Riley, the mission had always been the thing that mattered, not the recognition that followed it. She had walked away from a life of secrecy, opting for peace instead of fame. Yet the ghost of her past still lingered, watching from the shadows. But there was one thing Riley could never escape the pull of duty. It was in her blood, in the way she carried herself, in the way she assessed every situation as if her life depended on it, because, in her world, it always did. And while she had put down the rifle and hung up her gear, the skills she had honed were never far from her reach. They were a part of her, woven into the very fabric of her being. Even in this peaceful suburban life, Riley's instincts remained sharp. She observed the world around her with a level of detail that most people would miss. The sound of footsteps behind her was enough to alert her to the presence of someone coming up the driveway. The slightest shift in the wind could tell her what the weather was going to do next. It wasn't paranoia, it was just her way of being. It was the product of years of training, of being in situations where every detail could mean the difference between life and death. Despite the tranquility that surrounded her now, Riley's heart would always carry the burden of the life she had left behind. She had never asked for this life, this quiet existence, but she had learned to embrace it. Yet there was something about her that couldn't be hidden forever. No matter how hard she tried, her past had a way of catching up to her, even in the most unlikely of places. And so, Riley lived her life in the shadows, A woman of extraordinary skill in an ordinary world, she was a living testament to the fact that greatness didn't always look like what people imagined. Sometimes it was found in the quietest of moments, in the softest of footsteps, and in the unassuming gaze of someone who had seen it all. People who passed her by would never know what lay beneath the surface, but those who took the time to look a little closer would see the truth in her eyes. And that truth was this: Riley Shaw was no ordinary woman. She was a weapon of precision, a master of her craft, and a legend in her own right, waiting, quietly, for the world to catch up. This was the life Riley Shaw had chosen for herself. Ordinary to the outside world, extraordinary to those who knew what to look for. Yet, no matter where she went or how far she ran, her past would always follow her, silent, patient, and ready to reveal itself when the time was right. The tension at Redstone Base had reached a boiling point. Inside a mock urban warfare training complex, 6 young recruits were being held hostage by a man whose face was twisted with desperation and anger. The man, a former military contractor, was armed with a homemade explosive device, its wires crisscrossing his chest like an intricate, deadly puzzle. His fingers trembled as they hovered over the detonator. Any sudden movement, any mistake, could trigger the explosion, taking everyone inside the building with him. Outside, the base's tactical teams were set in place, surrounding the building, but they were trapped in a nightmare. Every possible option to resolve the situation was flawed, and no one knew how to proceed. The negotiators had failed, and the man's erratic behavior made communication impossible. The conventional approaches, the ones that had worked in countless other hostage situations, were now meaningless. No one could risk taking the shot. No one could get close enough to disarm him. The dead man's switch would guarantee a horrific outcome. The base was stuck. Riley Shaw, though just a visitor, had been standing on the perimeter of the training complex, watching the simulated operation unfold. She hadn't planned on getting involved. She had only come to visit an old friend, but when she noticed the growing unease in the soldiers around her, she realized something was wrong. The atmosphere was different, more serious than any training exercise should have been. She could feel it in the air, the unmistakable weight of real danger. People were starting to whisper, eyes darting toward the building, then to the ground, unable to face what was unfolding. They weren't talking about tactics anymore. They were talking about options, but all of them were impossible. There was no way in, no way to save the recruits without causing a tragedy. The situation was getting worse by the second. Outside the building, the tactical teams had taken positions, their rifles trained on the windows and doors, waiting for an opening. But it was clear there was no safe shot. The man's hands were twitching, his eyes wide with panic as he muttered to himself, clearly in the grips of a mental breakdown. He had been a soldier once, someone who had seen the horrors of war, but now, in the aftermath of it all, he was a shell of the man he once was. PTSD had shattered him, and now it had become a weapon. His grip on the detonator was all that stood between life and death for the 6 recruits trapped inside. Negotiations had failed. The man didn't respond to reason or logic, only to his inner demons. Every attempt to calm him down had been met with unpredictable bursts of anger or wild rambling. The negotiators, those trained in de-escalation, were powerless. They couldn't reach him. It was as though he was lost in a world of his own, hearing voices that no one else could hear, seeing things no one else could see. The base's SWAT team had been called in, but they were just as helpless. They couldn't breach the building because any jarring impact might trigger the explosive device. Every tactical move was a risk. Every second spent trying to find a way in only increased the chances of a catastrophic failure. Inside the command center, Colonel Monroe, the senior officer on the base, paced back and forth, his mind racing. He had seen situations like this before, hostage situations. Standoffs, but never with a threat this dire. The man's homemade bomb wasn't like the standard military explosives they were used to dealing with. It was unpredictable. It could detonate at the slightest pressure. The dead man's switch meant that if the man lost consciousness, even for a second, the trigger would be pulled. The stakes were too high. The clock was ticking, and each second that passed felt like an eternity. Riley stood in the background, watching everything unfold. She wasn't in charge, but she could see something that no one else seemed to be considering. She had spent years in high-pressure situations, years where the margin for error was razor thin, where failure meant death. Her training had taught her to think when others froze. Her mind immediately began calculating the situation, the angles, the wind, the distance to the target, the position of the recruits. She didn't need to be in the middle of it to see the only possible solution. The room was full of military personnel, experts in every field imaginable. But Riley's eyes were sharper. She could see the way the situation could be resolved if only someone had the courage to act. The military teams were paralyzed by their options. They couldn't move without risking an explosion. They couldn't talk their way out of it. And they couldn't shoot the man without triggering the detonator. Every strategy had been exhausted, and still, no one had the answer. The recruits inside were running out of time. Every minute they spent searching for a way in was another minute closer to disaster. Riley could hear the voices of the officers arguing in the background, debating plans that would never work. Their desperation was palpable, but their options were limited. It was a stalemate. The situation was spiraling, and they had no idea how to stop it. It was at this moment that Riley stepped forward. She wasn't an officer, not part of the command structure, but her instincts kicked in. She knew the risks. She understood the intricacies of the situation better than anyone in the room. Without a word, she walked toward one of the soldiers near the back of the room and took the rifle from his hands. He didn't question her. He didn't stop her. His focus was on the crisis, and he saw in Riley's eyes what he knew in his gut. She was the only one who had the skill to handle it. Riley didn't need anyone's permission. She had already assessed the variables in her mind. She had calculated the wind, the angle, and the time it would take for the bullet to reach the detonator without harming the man. The shot wasn't just difficult, it was impossible. But for someone like Riley Shaw, impossible wasn't a barrier. She had made her reputation on doing the impossible, and now, that same reputation would be what saved those recruits. The room fell silent as she moved into position. There was no fanfare, no dramatic build-up, just the quiet, determined movements of a woman who knew exactly what had to be done. She took a deep breath, lining up the rifle. Her hands were steady, her heart calm. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like a simple shot, but those who knew better understood that this was no ordinary marksmanship. This was the kind of precision that could only come from years of experience, from a level of skill that few in the world could ever hope to match. As Riley prepared to take the shot, the rest of the room seemed to disappear. The hum of the air, the distant chatter of the command center, it all faded into the background. In that moment, there was only the target and the shot. There was no room for error. There was no time for doubt. The only thing that mattered was the shot, and Riley Shaw didn't miss. The trigger was pulled. A sharp crack echoed through the air, and then nothing. Silence. For a moment, no one knew what had happened. The base personnel held their breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion, but it never came. The detonator had been destroyed, cleanly and precisely, without harming the man holding it. He was still alive, and the threat had been neutralized. Riley's shot had done the impossible. She had saved 6 lives, and no one could understand how, but one person knew. And that person had just walked into the room, realizing that a legend had just made a return. The seconds felt like hours as the team huddled around the monitors, eyes darting between the live feed of the hostage situation and the faces of their commanding officers. Riley stood quietly at the edge of the room, her presence almost invisible amidst the chaos. The military personnel surrounding her were consumed by the looming crisis, their faces tense, their words frantic. But Riley remained calm. She had seen worse. She had been in situations where the margin for error was not just thin, it was non-existent. But this was a different kind of challenge. It was a scenario no one could resolve with conventional methods. The clock was ticking. Every moment that passed brought them closer to a disaster. Inside the mock urban complex, the situation was worsening. The man, still clutching the detonator, stood with his back to the recruits, his face locked in a silent scream of rage and fear. His movements were erratic, unpredictable. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with anxiety. The negotiators had tried everything, but the man had slipped further into his mental abyss. He didn't hear them anymore. He was somewhere far away, lost in the trauma of his past. He couldn't hear the desperation in their voices, only the crackling noise in his mind urging him to pull the trigger. The tactical teams outside were in position, ready for action. But the risk was too great. A single misstep, a bullet that strayed even a millimeter off course, could set off the deadly device strapped to the man's chest. The clock was ticking, the air around the building heavy with the unbearable silence of indecision. It was as if the entire base had come to a standstill. The best minds in the room, the experts in tactical warfare, had all reached the same conclusion: there was no safe option. Negotiations were over. SWAT could not act. The only possible solution seemed to be the one no one dared speak aloud of. Shot, perfectly placed. One that would destroy the detonator without harming the suspect. Riley felt the pressure building in her chest. She had seen this before, the feeling of being surrounded, with nowhere to turn and no good option left. The key to this situation, however, wasn't force. It wasn't brute strength. It wasn't even negotiation. It was precision. A single, perfectly executed shot that could resolve everything. She knew what needed to be done, but she was not in charge. She was just a civilian visitor, an outsider who had no place in this mission. But Riley had trained for situations like this. She had been in enough life or death scenarios to know that sometimes the right thing to do was not to wait for permission. It was to act. She didn't say a word as she walked toward one of the soldiers, who was focused on the screen, his attention absorbed by the live feed. Without asking, she reached for the rifle resting on his shoulder. The soldier barely glanced at her, too lost in the weight of the situation to notice her move. Riley's fingers wrapped around the cold metal of the rifle, the familiar weight instantly grounding her. She checked the scope quickly, adjusting the focus to match the distance. In the background, the frantic discussions of the team continued, but Riley was already deep in concentration. She had done the calculations in her mind before she even touched the rifle. She had already figured out the wind, the angle, the distance, and the precise location of the detonator. Now, it was all about executing the shot. Every part of her training kicked in. Her breath slowed, her heartbeat steadied. The noise of the room faded into the background. In the years she had spent as a sniper, Riley had learned to block everything out. There was nothing but the target and the shot. And in this moment, with the lives of 6 recruits hanging in the balance, there was only one choice to take the shot that could save them all. The rifle settled into position against her shoulder. Its stock nestled perfectly into her shoulder pocket. She adjusted her stance slightly, ensuring her body was stable. Her eyes narrowed as she focused on the target. The man was still gripping the detonator, oblivious to the fact that his life was hanging by the thinnest of threads. His trembling fingers hovered just above the switch. But Riley knew he wasn't the real threat. The detonator was. She could hear the faintest sounds of movement in the background. The officers whispering about plans, but none of them mattered. It was just Riley now, just the rifle, and the shot. She adjusted the scope slightly. The angle was almost perfect. The wind was light, but she made sure to account for its drift. The time was critical, but Riley's mind remained calm. In her experience, there was no such thing as time, only precision, only the shot. It was all about making sure every factor lined up perfectly. Her training had taught her to think beyond what seemed possible. This was the moment she had been prepared for her entire life. A moment when everything else, every failure, every lost opportunity, meant nothing. She took a deep breath, held it, and then let it out slowly, her focus narrowing even further. She didn't feel the weight of the situation, not yet. Not until after the shot. Now, there was only the target, the trigger, and the fraction of a second that would change everything. The tension in the room was unbearable. Riley's finger tightened on the trigger, her movements fluid and practiced. She let the crosshairs settle on the detonator, aligning it perfectly. A sudden shift in the man's stance caused her to adjust, but she never lost sight of the target. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew the risks, and she knew that, for this to work, every element had to fall into place. She steadied herself, and then, in one smooth motion, she squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked slightly against her shoulder, the shot echoing through the air like the sound of a hammer hitting an anvil. In that instant, everything seemed to stop. For a second, no one moved, no one breathed. Riley's eyes were still locked on the scope, waiting for the result. Then came the silence. The man's hands fell limp to his sides. His fingers released their grip on the detonator, which now lay shattered in the dirt. The tactical teams outside had watched, waiting, and they were already moving into position as the danger had been neutralized. They stormed the building, securing the hostages, taking the man into custody without a shot fired. Riley lowered the rifle slowly, her hands steady as they returned the weapon to its rightful place. There was no cheer, no applause. There was only a quiet moment of relief, and a sense of awe that lingered in the air. The impossible shot had been made, and lives had been saved. But Riley didn't need the recognition. For her, this was just another day doing what she did best. In the aftermath, as the base personnel gathered around to assess what had just happened, the whispers started. They tried to understand what they had just witnessed, but none of them could fully grasp it. There was no logical explanation for what Riley had just done. There was only the unmistakable truth she had done the impossible. And Riley, as always, remained silent, knowing that for her, this was just another mission completed. No recognition, no glory, just a job done. But for the lives she had saved, it would mean the world. For Riley, that was enough. The situation had been resolved, the danger was over, and the personnel at Redstone Base were starting to relax. But in the aftermath of the crisis, a new kind of tension was beginning to simmer. It wasn't the kind of tension that came from life or death decisions, but from the confusion surrounding Riley's impossible shot. The crowd that had gathered around her, initially silent with awe, began to murmur, offering their own explanations for what they had just witnessed. As the tactical teams moved in, securing the area and ensuring the safety of the recruits, the buzz of conversation started to pick up. A young lieutenant, eager to offer his insight, was the first to voice what everyone else seemed to be thinking. He stood a little taller now, looking around the group as if waiting for someone to acknowledge the brilliance of his theory. "It must have been luck," he said confidently. "A pure stroke of luck. The bullet must have ricocheted off some metallic surface and hit the detonator. Just right." He paused, making sure everyone was listening. When that happened, it created an electromagnetic pulse that short-circuited the detonator. His tone carried the weight of someone explaining a complex scientific concept, his words dripping with certainty. The group around him nodded along, some faces lighting up as if the mystery had been solved. One or two others even murmured in agreement, impressed by the apparent technical sophistication of the explanation. Riley, standing quietly at the edge of the group, heard every word. She couldn't help but smile to herself. The absurdity of the theory was almost too much. Electromagnetic pulses, a ricochet causing a short circuit Riley had made, that shot with precision, with calculated focus. The last thing she needed was someone trying to explain it away with fantasy. Her smile was subtle, but it was there, a small tug at the corner of her lips that reflected the quiet amusement she felt. She'd heard theories like this before, the kinds of explanations that people would come up with when they couldn't accept what had just happened. The idea that a civilian, someone who didn't belong to the military, could make a shot so impossible, so precise, was hard for them to wrap their heads around. After all, what kind of person could do that? Certainly not someone they assumed to be. Just another civilian, someone who didn't wear the uniform. The young lieutenant continued, his voice growing more animated as he expounded on his theory. "It's a 1 in a million chance," he said. "But with all the right conditions, it's possible. I mean, modern detonators are vulnerable to electromagnetic interference." "Right." He cast a glance over the group as if to check for approval. "That's why the bullet didn't trigger the explosion." Several in the crowd looked impressed by the theory. A staff sergeant nearby even joined in, agreeing with the lieutenant's explanation. "Makes sense," he said with a nod. "That's some serious physics right there." The discussion began to take on a life of its own, with each person offering their own variation of the electromagnetic pulse theory. One person even suggested that the reflection off a metallic surface created an electromagnetic field that neutralized the detonator. Others chimed in, adding their own scientific insights into how the shot could have been so precise. Meanwhile, Riley stood there, trying her best not to laugh. She was amused, but more than that, she was struck by the irony. These men and women, some of the best trained military personnel in the world, were all desperately trying to rationalize something they couldn't possibly understand. They were so caught up in their own ideas of what was possible, they couldn't see the simplest truth that it was skill, not luck or electromagnetic pulses, that had made the shot. It was a strange feeling for Riley. She had spent years in the shadows, executing impossible missions, making the shots that others could never dream of. But now, standing in front of them, she realized that the thing they could never understand wasn't her skill, but their own inability to recognize it. It wasn't arrogance, it was just the way things were. They had a limited frame of reference, and that frame of reference didn't allow for the kind of precision that Riley was capable of. As the discussions continued, Riley remained calm and composed. She was tempted to step in, to correct them, but she knew it would do no good. People had their theories, and once they latched onto an idea, it was hard to shake. Besides, they weren't ready to hear the truth yet. They were still trying to fit her actions into a box they could understand. But she knew that the box they were trying to put her in wasn't big enough to contain what she had done. Just then, Colonel Monroe arrived, having been briefed on the resolution of the crisis. He had been monitoring the situation from the command center, and now, as he stepped into the area where the personnel had gathered, his eyes immediately went to Riley. He had seen everything unfold, but there was something about the way she was standing there, quietly listening to the debate around her, that made him pause. Monroe had seen many skilled soldiers in his time, but he had also read the reports from the Ghost Division. He had known, or at least suspected, that someone like Riley might be here, in front of him, but he had never expected to see her in such an ordinary setting. Monroe's gaze flicked toward the group of soldiers still discussing the impossible shot, and he could see the confusion written on their faces. They were trying to explain something that couldn't be explained. And then, it clicked. He recognized the posture, the stillness in her demeanor. He had seen it before. The sharpness, the quiet confidence. This was the work of someone who had been trained to see the world differently, to understand things that others simply couldn't. Monroe's heart skipped a beat. He had seen this before, in classified reports about Ghost Division snipers. Riley Shaw. It was her. As Monroe's realization hit, the noise around him seemed to fade away. The chatter from the group of soldiers continued, but it was no longer important. The magnitude of what had just occurred was becoming clear to him. Monroe turned toward Riley, his expression softening as he took in the quiet composure she exhibited. He approached her slowly, as if he were walking into the presence of a legend. The lieutenant, still animated and confident in his explanation, didn't notice Monroe's approach at first. He was too wrapped up in explaining his theory about electromagnetic pulses. But Monroe's voice cut through the chatter. "Enough," he said quietly, but firmly. The room fell silent as everyone turned toward him. "The shot that saved those lives today," he continued, his voice gaining strength, "wasn't luck. It wasn't an accident. And it certainly wasn't because of electromagnetic interference." The room shifted. The air suddenly charged with an understanding that had been absent just moments before. Monroe's gaze settled on Riley, and his tone softened, a deep respect in his voice. "That shot," he said, pausing for a moment, "was made by someone whose skill exceeds anything that can be explained by science fiction. This woman," he gestured toward Riley, "is one of the best snipers to ever serve in the military. And what she did today isn't just a miracle. It's a testament to the kind of precision we only dream of." The young lieutenant's face drained of color, his confident expression collapsing as he realized what had just happened. His theory, his explanation, crumbled in the face of the truth. The staff sergeant who had agreed with him just moments ago now looked at Riley in awe, his mouth slightly agape. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the soft sound of footsteps as Riley turned to walk away. Her calm demeanor unchanged. Monroe's voice, however, rang clear. "I hope we all understand now," he said, addressing the room. "There's more to marksmanship than science. Some things can't be explained. They can only be done." And Riley Shaw just proved that. As the realization spread through the crowd, the tone of the room shifted. What had once been confusion and doubt was now replaced by awe and respect. Monroe turned to Riley, offering a silent nod of acknowledgement. She didn't need more. The quiet recognition was enough. The aftermath of the crisis at Redstone Base rippled through the facility, like a shockwave, as the base personnel began to process the incredible sequence of events that had unfolded. There was an underlying current of disbelief. For all their training, all their years of experience, no one had expected the solution to come from the most unlikely source. But that's exactly what had happened. Riley Shaw, a woman who had been nothing more than a shadow in the eyes of most, had stepped in and made the impossible shot that saved 6 lives. Colonel Monroe, the commanding officer, was the first to fully comprehend the magnitude of what had occurred. As the base personnel continued to absorb the news, he found himself stepping forward, moving through the gathering with a purpose. His usual composure had been replaced by a profound respect, one that was hard-earned through years of military service. Riley's actions had not just resolved a crisis, they had redefined what was possible. Monroe knew that this moment would forever change how they viewed her and how they viewed the capabilities of those who operated in the shadows. Out of sight but never out of mind, he cleared his throat, his voice steady, yet carrying an authority that made everyone fall silent. "What we've just witnessed here today," he began, his eyes scanning the crowd, was not a miracle. It wasn't luck. It wasn't some stroke of cosmic chance. It was precision. It was expertise. And it was the kind of skill that we are privileged to see only in the most extraordinary individuals. Monroe's gaze shifted to Riley, standing just a few paces away, her hands still steady from the shot that had turned the tide. He nodded to her. Riley Shaw didn't just save lives today. She redefined what we think is possible. The room was still. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. The officers who had initially dismissed Riley, assuming she was just a visitor with no understanding of the situation, now stood in awe. The young lieutenant who had spent so much time explaining the improbable shot through the lens of scientific theories shifted uncomfortably. his earlier confidence now crumbling under the weight of Monroe's words. It was clear to everyone now that this wasn't a lucky accident. It was calculated. It was methodical. It was the work of someone who had seen it all and was capable of doing what others could not even fathom. Monroe's voice broke through the tension again, now filled with admiration. "This woman," he said, gesturing toward Riley, "has served in ways that few of us will ever truly understand. Her work, her skill, her contributions, they've kept special operations teams alive in missions, so classified that most of you will never hear of them." His tone softened, almost as if he were speaking to someone who had finally earned their rightful place in history. "But today, right here, we've all witnessed the kind of expertise that doesn't seek recognition, that doesn't chase the spotlight. Riley Shaw didn't want to be noticed, but she deserves to be." Riley, who had remained stoic throughout the whole process, didn't seek the attention now being directed at her. She was accustomed to the shadows, to operating quietly without fanfare. For years, she had kept her identity hidden, remaining just another face in the crowd, never wanting the accolades or the praise. She had walked away from the military life not because she wasn't proud of her service, but because she had done her part. Her work spoke for itself. It always had. Yet here, in this moment, Riley found herself not only recognized but celebrated in a way she had never anticipated. The realization of her impact was settling in, and it was more profound than any mission success or mission failure she had experienced in her past. This was different. This was about the kind of respect that came not from an official medal or a public announcement, but from the quiet understanding of what she had done, what she had always done. The silence stretched on for a few moments before Colonel Monroe turned to the gathered personnel again. His voice was resolute. What Riley demonstrated today was the embodiment of our core values: precision, discipline, and excellence. But what many of you don't realize is that this precision wasn't just achieved. Through years of training, it was earned. It was earned in the fields, in situations where failure wasn't an option. And that kind of skill doesn't just disappear. It doesn't go away. It is a part of you, whether you wear the uniform or not. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Riley didn't need to be a part of a unit anymore. She had already proven herself in ways that others couldn't even imagine. The military personnel who stood around her now realized that they had just witnessed something truly extraordinary, something they would never forget. Monroe turned to Riley once more. "On behalf of every person whose life was saved today, I thank you," he said quietly, his voice carrying the full weight of his respect. He stepped forward, offering her a salute, one that was reserved for those who had achieved the highest levels of excellence in their field. "You've not only saved lives, you've reminded us all of what real skill looks like." Riley's response was simple, as it always had been. She returned the salute, her movements deliberate and precise, a silent acknowledgement of the respect she had earned. There was no need for further words. Her actions had already spoken louder than anything she could say. The atmosphere in the room shifted once again, this time to one of admiration and reflection. The personnel who had once dismissed Riley as just a civilian, a bystander in a military crisis, now saw her for what she truly was, a legend in her own right. And in that moment, there was no longer any doubt. Riley Shaw's contributions to the military world were not just about the precision of her shots, but about the way she operated, the humility with which she approached every mission, and the respect she had earned from those who understood what it took to make the impossible a reality. As the crowd began to disperse, several officers made their way over to Riley, offering their own forms of recognition. Some of them simply nodded in acknowledgement, while others lingered, wanting to speak with her, wanting to understand what made her so exceptional. Yet Riley remained as she always had, quiet, reserved, and focused on the task at hand. She didn't need accolades. She didn't need recognition. Her work, her skill, and the lives she had saved spoke for themselves. In the days that followed, word of Riley's actions spread throughout the base and beyond. It didn't take long for the impact of what had happened to be fully realized. Special operations units from across the country were talking about the shot she had made, the level of precision that had been demonstrated, and the kind of marksmanship that was now being recognized as something extraordinary. What had once been whispered about in secret was now out in the open. And while Riley's name wasn't shouted from the rooftops, it was respected in every corner of the military world. Colonel Monroe, for his part, made it clear to anyone who would listen that Riley was a force to be reckoned with, not just because of the shot she made, but because of the discipline, the humility, and the unwavering commitment to the mission that she had always demonstrated. He took it upon himself to ensure that Riley's contributions were properly acknowledged, not just within Redstone Base, but across the broader military community. Her legacy would live on, not as a story told by others, but as a truth that was undeniable and deeply respected. In the end, Riley Shaw was not just a sniper. She was a reminder of what it truly meant to serve, to operate in the shadows, to save lives without seeking praise, and to demonstrate the kind of expertise that could change everything with just a single shot. She had shown them all what it meant to be exceptional, and in doing so, had earned a place among the legends.